When the black butler took off his gloves, no one expected the secret he hid. For years, the Langford estate had stood as a symbol of old wealth and older secrets. A mansion built of gray stone and crowned with ivy, it loomed over the countryside like a relic of another time. Its marble floors gleamed with a polished perfection, its chandeliers dripped crystal light, and its gardens stretched into mazes where whispers could vanish into hedges. It was the kind of place that seemed timeless, where the people who lived inside carried themselves with entitlement, and those who served them remained shadows. Among those shadows was the butler. His name was Elijah, though few in the household used it. To the Langford family, he was simply the butler, a presence as predictable as the ticking grandfather clock in the great hall. Always in a crisp black uniform, gloves pulled tightly over his hands, Elijah moved with a quiet precision that never faltered. He anticipated needs before they were spoken, appeared when least expected, and disappeared when no longer required. For the Langfords, Elijah was both invisible and indispensable. Guests admired his flawless service, but rarely looked him in the eye. He was part of the house, as much as the silver candelabras or the sweeping staircase. Yet behind his calm demeanor and lowered gaze, something unspoken lingered, an aura that unsettled those who paid attention long enough to notice. His silence was not the silence of submission, but of calculation. The family patriarch, Charles Langford, often boasted to his guests that Elijah was the finest servant a household could ever have. Discreet, loyal, precise, he would say with a chuckle, as glasses of brandy clinked and cigar smoke filled the air. Few knew that Charles's words came with an edge of arrogance, the kind that assumed Elijah's loyalty was unquestionable, his life bound by the house he served. But the truth was far more complicated. Elijah had watched this family for years. He had seen the rot behind the polished facade, the cruelty hidden in whispered insults, the manipulations that destroyed reputations, the greed that devoured everything around it. And while the Langfords believed their power made them untouchable, Elijah carried knowledge they could never imagine. Always, he kept his gloves on. No one questioned why, no one dared to ask. They were part of his uniform, part of the image of perfection. But behind those gloves was a truth, one that could upend the entire Langford dynasty if revealed. The nights at the estate stretched into rituals. Grand dinners where aristocrats laughed at the expense of others, galas where jewels sparkled under candlelight, mornings where gossip clung to the walls like perfume. Through it all, Elijah glided silently, serving, watching, remembering. He was the keeper of their secrets, but he also had one of his own. And then came the night that shifted everything. A storm had rolled over the countryside, rain hammering the windows of the Langford mansion, lightning slicing the sky. The family had gathered for a dinner, joined by investors and rivals alike. The air was thick with tension masked by politeness. Elijah moved between the guests, pouring wine, clearing plates. But as the thunder roared, all eyes shifted for a moment to the butler, who, for the first time, faltered. His gloved hand trembled as he lifted a silver tray, and one of the guests noticed. Whispers began, subtle but sharp, like knives gliding over glass. Why did the butler tremble? Why did he never remove those gloves? Not even in the suffocating heat of summer. Not even when no one was watching. Elijah caught the looks, the way suspicion sharpened. And though his face betrayed nothing, his mind raced. He knew what it meant. The questions were beginning. And if the questions grew, they might lead to answers the Langfords weren't ready to face. That night, long after the guests had retired, Elijah stood alone in the darkened hall. The gloves on his hands felt heavier than ever, as if they carried the weight of the past he had buried. He flexed his fingers beneath them, staring at the thin barrier between himself and the truth he had hidden for so long. He knew it couldn't stay hidden forever. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm building inside the house, and soon the gloves would come off. The morning after the storm, the Langford estate looked as though nothing had changed. The rain had washed the gardens clean. The marble floors gleamed as Elijah had polished them. and the scent of roses filled the corridors from the fresh arrangements he placed in crystal vases. Yet beneath the surface calm, the air inside the mansion carried a weight heavier than thunderclouds. The guests from the stormy night lingered over breakfast in the dining hall, their polite chatter covering the sharp edges of their curiosity. But gossip has a way of slipping past civility. The small tremor of Elijah's gloved hand had not gone unnoticed. And in a house where appearances meant everything, even the tiniest crack was magnified into scandal. Some whispered of illness. Others speculated about scars from a fire or some unspeakable injury. But the most dangerous whispers were the ones that tied his mystery to power. What if the butler wasn't who he seemed? What if his gloves weren't for shame, but for concealment of something far more sinister? Elijah, as always, moved quietly among them. He served tea, replenished fruit bowls, and ensured every napkin was folded with immaculate precision. Yet he could feel their stares like daggers at his back. They were trying to peel away his silence, to force meaning from the emptiness he left behind. Charles Langford, oblivious to the tension, dismissed it all with arrogance. "A servant's quirks are none of your concern," he declared to his guests with a dismissive laugh. But Charles did not realize that curiosity, once sparked, only grows stronger when forbidden. His dismissal fanned the intrigue rather than extinguished it. By noon, a guest wandered too far into the private wing of the house and found herself in the butler's quarters. The small room shocked her, not for its austerity, but for its order. Every object was in its place, polished and neat, except for a single locked box tucked beneath the desk. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't open. The guest left quickly, but her discovery became another. Whispered rumor. Why would a servant need to lock anything away in such a house of transparency? Meanwhile, Elijah continued his duties with his usual precision. But inside, he felt the pressure building. For years, he had controlled every movement, every gesture, every glance. His gloves had become more than fabric. They were armor. Now, for the first time, he wondered if that armor was failing him. That evening, the Langfords hosted a small gathering for investors. It was less grand than their galas, but more dangerous in consequence. The family's reputation depended on perfect appearances, and Elijah was the quiet conductor of that perfection. Every candle lit at the same height, every dish served at the exact moment, every glass polished to brilliance. Yet as Elijah leaned to serve Charles's brandy, a sudden flicker of flame from the candelabra caught the edge of his glove. In an instant, a thin line of smoke curled into the air. He pulled back swiftly, dousing the spark before it spread. The glove was saved, but a small tear had appeared along the seam near his wrist. It was hardly noticeable, a tiny imperfection that anyone else might ignore. But one of the guests noticed. A woman with sharp eyes and sharper instincts leaned forward, catching a glimpse of skin beneath the frayed seam. She said nothing, but her silence carried weight. Elijah felt her gaze on him long after he retreated from the table. Later that night, when the mansion fell quiet, Elijah returned to his quarters and removed the damaged glove. His hand beneath was unscarred, strong, and unblemished, but marked with something far more dangerous, a symbol, etched into his skin with precision, glowing faintly in the candlelight. It was not a tattoo in the common sense. It carried the design of something ancient, something that did not belong in a servant's life. Elijah stared at the mark, the memory of its origin pressing against his mind. Like a locked door rattling in a storm, he had buried the truth for so long, convinced himself he could live as nothing more than a shadow in the Langford estate. But now the cracks were widening, and the house was full of eyes. In the silence, he slid the glove back on and tightened the fabric. He knew the Langfords could not know, and their guests must never find out. Because if anyone recognized the symbol, it would not only destroy him, it would bring down everything the Langfords thought they controlled. Outside his window, the storm clouds had returned. Rolling dark and heavy across the horizon, Elijah watched them gather and understood. Storms never truly ended. They only waited for the right moment to strike again. And inside the mansion, that moment was drawing closer with every breath. The mansion still gleamed with the polish of Elijah's work. Yet underneath its marble beauty, something was shifting. The gossip, once soft and idle, had begun to coil like smoke around every corner of the Langford estate. Guests spoke in hushed tones, Servants exchanged wary glances, and the family pretended not to notice. But Elijah knew that pretending had limits. The tear in his glove had been small. But in a house built on appearances, even the smallest flaw could trigger an avalanche. The memory of the woman's sharp gaze lingered in his mind. Had she seen the mark? Or had it been hidden by shadows and luck? He told himself not to wonder, but the unease gnawed at him. That night, when the mansion was asleep, Elijah lit a single candle in his quarters. He removed his gloves slowly, as though the very act might summon the past he had tried so hard to bury. The mark glowed faintly under the flickering light. It was shaped like an intricate crest, curves interwoven with sharp lines, resembling both a crown and a shackle. It was not something a man chose for himself. It was given and it bound him. He remembered, against his will, the day it was burned into his skin. He had been young, far younger than anyone realized. When men cloaked in authority and wealth had gathered in a hidden chamber, they had spoken of legacy, bloodlines, and control. He had not understood all of it then, but he had understood the pain as they seared the symbol into his flesh, making him part of something larger, darker. The symbol was the mark of the House of Ashcroft, a secretive dynasty tied to old money, influence, and whispers of control stretching across continents. To those who knew it was not a scar, it was proof of lineage. Elijah was not just a butler. He was heir to a legacy far older and far more powerful than the Langfords themselves. But power is a dangerous inheritance. To claim it would mean exposure. To hide it meant living as a shadow. Elijah had chosen the latter, or at least he had believed he had. The Langfords, oblivious, had grown to depend on him completely. Charles barked orders, but it was Elijah's silent orchestration that made the house function. Eleanor Langford hosted grand soirée, but it was Elijah's discipline that made them flawless. The children whispered secrets, knowing Elijah would never betray them. They believed him to be beneath them, when in truth, he was the very scaffolding holding their fragile empire upright. But storms were gathering in more ways than one. Charles Langford's investments were faltering. The family's wealth, though still outwardly dazzling, was straining under hidden debts. Rumors of betrayal in business circles threatened to tarnish their name. Guests no longer came to marvel. They came to calculate, to measure weakness. And now Elijah's own secret was stirring beneath the surface, threatening to intertwine with the Langfords' unraveling. It was during one of Charles's investor dinners that the inevitable occurred. Elijah moved through the dining hall with his usual precision, but the woman who had noticed his glove earlier kept her eyes fixed on him. Her name was Margaret Alcott, widow of a banking magnate, and she had made her fortune, not only by inheritance, but by unearthing truths others wished to keep hidden. As Elijah poured her wine, the faint seam of his repaired glove tugged ever so slightly, revealing the edge of the mark beneath. Margaret's eyes widened, not in shock, but in recognition. Her hand trembled only for a moment before she smiled politely, concealing the weight of what she had just seen. Elijah noticed. He noticed everything, and for the first time in years he felt true fear. Later that night, as the mansion settled into uneasy quiet, Margaret requested a private word with Charles Langford. No one knew what she whispered into his ear, but by morning the household felt different. Charles watched Elijah more closely, his arrogance tinged now with suspicion. Eleanor avoided his gaze, though she had never done so before. The servants exchanged hushed rumors with new urgency. Elijah realized then that the walls were closing in. The secret he had carried in silence was no longer his alone. Someone knew and others would soon follow. Standing alone in his quarters, he pressed his bare hand against the mirror, staring at the glowing mark reflected back at him. For years he had told himself he could live as a ghost, unseen, unheard, a servant by choice. But now, the mark was calling him back to the life he had fled. And the Langfords, who believed themselves his masters, were about to discover just how little power they truly held. The Langford mansion stood tall under the weight of its chandeliers and painted ceilings, but inside its foundations were trembling. Elijah felt it in the air, suspicion, unease, and a silence that no amount of silver, polish, or well-laid table settings could conceal. For years he had operated unseen, his presence more like the rhythm of the walls than a man among them. But now every eye lingered on him too long. Every word bent toward him, Every pause seemed to wait for him to slip. It had begun with Margaret Alcott. The widow's gaze was sharper than the gilded knives she toyed with at dinner, and when she whispered to Charles Langford that night, a new current had flowed through the household. The master of the mansion, once arrogant in his dismissal of Elijah, began to watch his butler with thinly veiled suspicion. At first it was subtle. Questions about accounts, inquiries into his duties, unnecessary remarks about loyalty. But as days turned into weeks, Charles's temper grew shorter, his tone edged with something more dangerous than contempt. Fear. Eleanor Langford, ever the hostess, retreated behind her pearls and painted smile. She no longer sought Elijah's advice on seating charts or menu choices, and when their eyes met across the marble floors, hers darted away as though she had touched something forbidden. The children, confused by the change, whispered among themselves, sensing that the man who had raised them in silence was not who they believed him to be. But the servants spoke loudest in the shadows. They whispered about the mark, though none had truly seen it, and what it might mean. Some claimed Elijah bore the seal of a secret brotherhood. Others whispered that he was marked by the devil himself. The gossip, once idle, became sharp enough to wound, and gossip in the Langford estate had a way of leaking beyond its walls. One evening, as the family hosted another round of fragile investors, Elijah felt the walls closing tighter. Margaret Alcott was among the guests, her watchful eyes never straying far from him. This time she brought company, 2 men in tailored coats, their expressions unreadable but their gaze heavy on Elijah's hands. They introduced themselves as family friends, but Elijah knew better. These were not mere socialites. They were seekers, hunters of influence and secrets. That night, Charles summoned Elijah to his study. The room was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of brandy, and the master sat behind his desk like a man clinging to authority. Margaret sat beside him, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Her lips curled in a smile that carried no warmth. They spoke at length about loyalty, heritage, and power. Words meant not for servants, but for equals. And though they never named it, Elijah felt the truth pressing against him. They knew about the mark. Or at least they knew enough to sense its value. Margaret leaned closer, her eyes narrowing with curiosity and hunger. "The world is shifting," she murmured, her voice like silk sliding over steel. "Bloodlines matter again. Symbols matter again. You carry something that could change the balance of power." Elijah's chest tightened. He had fled that world years ago, buried his past beneath years of servitude, hoping the dust of labor would smother the glow of the mark. But now it seemed the past had tracked him down. When he returned to his quarters, the house seemed smaller, its halls suffocating. He sat in silence, staring at his gloves folded neatly on the table. His hands trembled as he reached for them, but he did not put them on. Instead, he stared at the mark, its lines glowing faintly in the candlelight. The crest was more than a reminder, it was a claim. It declared him as something greater than the Langfords, greater than Margaret, greater than anyone who tried to hold him in chains of service. But power had never been his pursuit. Freedom was. The following morning, word spread through the mansion like wildfire. A secret meeting was to be held. Margaret Alcott had invited the Langfords' most powerful allies, industrialists, bankers, politicians, cloaked in civility but sharpened by greed. They were to gather in the mansion's great hall, not for dinner but for revelation, and Elijah knew with dreadful certainty who the centerpiece of that gathering would be. As the day drew near, the mansion seemed to transform. Servants scurried nervously, preparing for an event none fully understood. Charles's temper flared at the smallest misstep, while Eleanor wept quietly behind locked doors. The children, sensing the tremor of doom, clung to Elijah with questions he could not answer. On the night of the meeting, the great hall glittered with wealth and ambition. Margaret Alcott stood tall among the guests, her eyes gleaming with triumph. Charles Langford, though visibly nervous, tried to wear the mask of control, and Elijah, summoned like a performer, was ordered to stand before them all. As the chandeliers blazed overhead and every eye fixed upon him, Elijah felt the room tilt toward revelation. He could feel the mark beneath his glove burning, demanding to be seen. The whispers grew louder, the tension sharper, until silence gripped the hall like a fist. And then Margaret's voice cut through it all. "Remove the gloves." The demand was not a suggestion, but a command, one spoken with the confidence of someone who believed she already owned the truth. The room leaned forward, hungry, expectant, and Elijah stood frozen, his heart hammering, knowing that the moment he obeyed, nothing would ever be the same again. The great hall had never felt so heavy, so suffocating. Its chandeliers glittered above, spilling golden light over velvet curtains and polished floors. But beneath the shimmer, the room was thick with greed and anticipation. Every guest, the bankers, the politicians, the industrial giants, leaned forward in their chairs like predators circling prey. At the center of it all stood Elijah, the butler, who for years had been invisible, now thrust beneath their gaze as though he were a prize to be claimed. Margaret Alcott's eyes gleamed with victory, her smile sharp as glass. She had waited for this moment, weaving suspicion into curiosity until it became undeniable hunger. Charles Langford, seated at her side, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his arrogance cracking under the pressure. Eleanor Langford clutched her pearls, her knuckles white, while the children huddled together, their wide eyes fixed on the man, who had raised them more faithfully than their own parents ever had. The silence deepened until it seemed even the walls leaned closer to hear. Then came the words, firm and merciless. "Remove the gloves." The command sliced through the room. It was not simply a request for truth. It was a demand for ownership, an attempt to strip Elijah bare before them all. For a moment, Elijah did not move. His breath was steady, his face expressionless, but inside a storm raged. Years of servitude, years of silence, years of swallowing his true self to fit the role forced upon him. They all thundered inside his chest. He had hidden for so long, believing invisibility was safety. But now, he understood that hiding had only made him prey to those who would exploit him. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah reached for his gloves. His hands trembled not with fear, but with the weight of inevitability. The crowd leaned closer, breathless, as the leather slid from his fingers. First the right hand, then the left. And there it was, the mark. Etched into his skin like fire, the crest glowed faintly in the golden light. It was not merely a scar nor a tattoo. It was a living emblem, its lines forming a symbol known to only a select few, the seal of the Duval bloodline, an ancient house erased from history but once more powerful than kings. The mark pulsed with quiet authority, as though recognizing the moment it had waited for all along. Gasps rippled through the hall. Some guests recoiled in shock, others leaned closer in fascination. Margaret Alcott's face froze, her triumphant smile shattering into disbelief. She had expected a curiosity, a token of power she could wield, but what she saw instead was something greater and something she could not control. The whispers rose like a storm. A Duval. It cannot be. They were wiped out. But Elijah stood still, calm amidst the chaos. His silence carried more weight than their frantic voices. For the first time, Charles Langford looked small in his own mansion. The master of the estate paled, realizing that the man he had ordered about, the servant he had belittled, was not beneath him at all. He was above him, by blood, by legacy, by power that no wealth could buy. Margaret tried to recover, her voice sharp, commanding the crowd to see Elijah not as heir but as servant, daring to rise. But the tide had already shifted. The guests no longer looked at Elijah with contempt. They looked at him with awe and fear. Elijah turned his gaze toward the Langfords, and for a moment the room seemed to fall away. He saw the children who had clung to him in innocence, Eleanor trembling in her guilt, Charles shrinking in shame. He saw Margaret Alcott burning with rage at the truth she could not bend, and then he spoke without words. His very presence declared it. "I am no one's servant. I am heir to what you tried to bury." With quiet dignity, Elijah placed his gloves on the table, not as concealment but as a symbol. He would no longer hide. The legacy of the Duvals, thought lost, lived in him. The hall erupted into chaos, some rushing to offer allegiance, others fleeing in fear. The Langfords' empire, once built on arrogance and pretense, crumbled in an instant, overshadowed by the truth that had been living under their own roof. As the night bled into dawn, Elijah stood alone in the great hall, the light of morning breaking through the tall windows. For the first time in his life, he was not bound by gloves, by service, or by silence. He was free, not just to exist, but to claim the power he had carried all along. And though the world outside would come for him, hungry for what he represented, Elijah knew he would never again bow, because the black butler was no longer a shadow in the mansion. He was the storm that had been hidden within it.